If you've ever felt like something had to change with your podcast, but you just really weren't sure what it was, I want to talk to you today. We're going to talk about how to know when it's the right time to make changes, how to announce that and share that. If you need to announce that and share that, I'm going to talk about some of the changes I've made over the 599 episodes we've done of this podcast ahead of our big episode 600 next week. Let's get into it. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. It's here. It's time. Episode 599. And I want to talk about changes because as I was prepping for 600 and I was asking like what might be interesting to some clients and to some biz besties and just people in my world, there was a real theme to a lot of the questions. Some of them sort of manifested as like, how did you last this long? Some of them look like, how do you not get bored? How do you not give up? How do you still find things to talk about? Essentially, the answer to all of these questions is sometimes I make changes. And so I want to talk about some of those changes today, both internal, so like changes to the process and behind the scenes stuff, and some of the external stuff, like a podcast rebrand. In fact, if you haven't yet listened to the episode we did in December around our podcast rebrand, reshifting the show from Uncommonly More to the More Profitable Podcast, I'd take a listen to that one. We'll link to it in the show notes. It's going to cover a lot of the specifics of rebrand changes that we're going to kind of talk about today. Before we jump in, we are going to be hosting something brand new. I'm really excited about it. I have been craving hanging out in a room, a virtual room, but a room with podcasters like me, other service-based business owners who are using their show to generate, educate, and convert right fit clients. Because oftentimes when you spend time in podcast spaces, they are filled with people who are doing the really cool work of monetizing their show through sponsorships or like a Patreon situation or subscriptions, whatever the case may be. And maybe that's not how you're growing your show or how you're monetizing your show. Maybe you are monetizing your show like I monetize my show, which is why you're here, which is by selling your services, by promoting your offers. And the nuance there can be different. I always get great insights from the people who I hang out with who have other kinds of shows, but I really wanted us to create a space where we could have conversations about the kind of shows that you and I host. And so we are building out a podcaster roundtable, and it is going to be, to sign up, it's going to be up at uncommonlymore.com/roundtable. We're going to come together and we're going to talk about podcasting from our perspectives. This month, I thought we would take the focus of, first of all, it's open to whatever sort of comes out in the room, whatever we talk about, but I'm going to kick off our conversation talking about some ways that I used this landmark episode 600 to create some of that launch energy and momentum that can happen when you have a course or a membership, or maybe you're, just launching a brand new show. Some of that initial momentum, which can be hard to capture when you're 600 episodes in and you sell a service where you can we welcome in clients all the time. As long as we've got capacity, our doors are open, right? So there's not that same energy that happens when you're launching a course or whatever. And there is some fun parts of that. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I've used this landmark episode to build some of that momentum in a way that was fun and was energizing and was impactful for my audience, but did not burn me out or any of the negative parts of that launching. All the reasons I love that we don't have to do that anymore. So I thought we would start our conversation there, kind of from that focus. If you'd like to join us, and I hope you will, head over to uncommonlymore.com/roundtable to reserve your seat. I am stoked for this. I think it's going to be a really cool place for us to come together and talk about what's happening in our shows now and what we want for our shows. I'm going to have some Q&A time. So if you want to come in and ask me questions about maybe what I've done with this promo and with these countdown episodes, cool. Come in, ask your questions. You'll get feedback from me. We'll talk together as a group. I'm really stoked. So again, uncommonlymore.com/roundtable has all the deets. Let's get into it. I want to break down some things today, and I want to start by talking about some signs that it's time to make a change. And I think the best way to do that is probably to talk about some times over the course of the last 10 years where I made changes to this show. So this show launched in 2013. It was 2 episodes a week, a solo episode and a guest episode. My solo episodes were usually somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. I talk so much. And my guest episodes were usually somewhere between 45 minutes and an hour, with the occasional one that went a little overboard and was like an hour and 15. It was nutty bananas. I can't, like, I'm a little stunned just thinking about it right now. I'm like, oh, that's a lot. One thing we have to keep in mind is this was 10 years ago. The landscape of podcasting looked very different. We lived in a world where it was still possible to run out of things to listen to. You know, the shows you listen to would be like consumed, and you'd be like, cool, wait until next week because there's not supply of options. And by the way, even fewer women than there are now. So it was a different landscape. It was a different time. And so that's what the show looked like then. And that evolved and changed. We talked about different stuff then. So when this show launched, we were selling done-for-you social media management services. And I say management very specifically because that's what we were doing, was management, not strategy. And so we were doing management services at the time. I still had some VA clients, some virtual assistant clients. When we first launched this show, I wasn't even selling like courses yet. Fast forward to like 2015, we started selling courses. Move into probably I think 2014 we started selling courses. 2015, 2016 we launched the Hit the Mic Backstage membership. By the way, the podcast was at the time called Hit the Mic with the Stacey Harris. That was and remains me. It was a very different show. And so it has, over the course of 10 years, evolved slowly. And there have been internal changes and there have been external changes. And I think that's a really good way to look at this because it allows us to see what we want to look for. And so what are some of these, varying degrees of color flags? What are these, yellow, orange, and red flags of change, so to speak? So internally, my sort of yellow flags that it's time to make a change is I'm simply bored. I'm just not having a good time. An orange flag starts to be like procrastination. I'm pushing off. I'm finding that I'm moving the due date of me recording an episode 2 or 3 times. I just keep pushing back my recording session. That's an orange flag. That's procrastination. Red flag, I have pushed the recording of this podcast to the point where I'm going to have to produce it myself. I'm going to have to record it, edit it, do the show notes, prep the graphics, review the transcript, which I will have to get done in an automated fashion, not through the incredible human that's on our team. Red flag. That I've procrastinated a while. And all of these internal changes tell me that there has to be a shift in my process or my content plan. So bored and early, like orange flag level procrastination process. It usually means I'm either in my head, which in full disclosure is what has happened in these episodes as we count down to 600, where I have been procrastinating recording a little bit because, I don't know, they felt bigger to me. They felt, monumental, right? And I wanted to, it was so important to me that these episodes specifically really deliver on the promise of this show and really were good. There's not even some sort of like, specific thing I can point to, but I got a little in my head about them. I do this with our biggest sales assets too sometimes. And so I will have to make changes to my process. I don't batch as often when I am in this place. I script more. I've got, generally this show is recorded, full disclosure, with a title, a working title, and 3 bullet points. When I'm doing something where I'm getting those yellow and orange flags, I'm changing it up. So if you saw my notes here, you would see that I have an intro written out. I've got my bullet points with sub bullet points. I've got my call to action highlighted, and I've got my call to action semi-scripted. All in our dashboard, all in our project management system, because I I need a little extra help getting this done. Because again, I've been kind of in my head about it. So really looking at changing that process, right? Making a shift to the how I'm getting it done. I'll also do silly things, like sometimes I will stand or sometimes I will walk between episodes. If I'm batching, but I'm in a place where I need a little extra energy and momentum and chutzpah, I don't know. I'll stand up or I will move. I often have, I always record with headphones on, either because I'm monitoring the show as I'm recording, I'm monitoring the audio, or because I'm listening to something, because I need sort of that brain stimulation as I'm showing up. That will help with energy. That will help with excitement. It will also help with keeping my butt in the chair and getting it done. And so when I see those sort of like boredom-y red flags, or honestly kind of like mindset-y things, that means it's got to be an internal change to the process. I've got to shift something, and that may be permanent. It is entirely likely, though, it is temporary. A great example of this is if you are somebody who batches, but only sometimes, you will find as you come in and out of batching, it will take a little while to get back on that horse. When I am in my sort of at my best batching, right? When I'm in fighting shape for batching, I can record 4 to 6 episodes, not lose any sleep at all. That's easy breezy. When I am not in fighting shape for batching, when I've taken a long break from batching, this often happens to me when we come back to record like February, March episodes in like January, and I've not recorded anything for a couple of months. I can do like 2 episodes at a time because I have to rebuild the sustained excitement and energy that comes with recording 4 episodes of a podcast and not sounding bored, so that you don't hear me sound bored and then feel bored. So those are some signs internal. Let's talk external. Then we're talking about like format and structural changes to the show. So when I talked about when we first launched the show, I talked about this was 2 episodes a week. We were talking about, I was selling social media management services. We talked about very different things. The show was structured very different. And so there's been a lot of changes along the way that were dictated by shifts that actually happened either internally in the business or externally in the market. For example, 2 episodes a week, both of which were 30 to 60 minutes long. That's not going to do well here. And what I was finding is people were listening to like every other episode, because I would have this like little spike, big spike, little spike, big spike, little spike, big spike on my release days. And so my subscribers were not tuning in at the same level every other episode. And there was a pattern to this. And the pattern was when I had guests on, my listenership dropped. So my audience told me something. Looking at the data informed a shift that was happening because my audience was consuming differently. That wasn't the case when we first launched the show. When we very first launched the show and we had the 2 episodes a week, they both did gangbusters. There are absolutely guest episodes that at the time were some of my top episodes. But as we hit probably like the 1 year mark, maybe the 18-month mark, that shifted dramatically. And it started moving towards my solo episodes would do gangbusters. But my guest episodes were like fine. They weren't bad. There wasn't like no one listening. But there was a significant enough drop off that I'm like, is the juice worth the squeeze on guest management here? And now I have a lot of thoughts on guests after 10 years of experience. And again, changes in the market. But yeah, I was like, this has got to change. And so looking at that data was my nudge for change, was my sign for change. I'm saying, this thing is actually less production effort is netting me better results. Let's refocus there. So we moved the show weekly. We moved the show to solo episodes primarily. I have still, over the years, had guests here and there. I think I probably have, in the last year or two, had the least guests that I've had in the course of the show. But I think we usually end up with 4 or 5 a year. How that change came from looking at that data. From an offer perspective, I think we can all agree that my offer looks mostly completely different now. However, I still sell done-for-you services. So, the business model is actually the most like when I launched my business that it's ever been. I have always had a portion of my revenue that came in via delivering services. It has always been my easiest way to make money, my fastest way to make money, my most reliable way to make money, and the cornerstone, the foundation that all other revenue was built on. So even when we ran Hit the Mic Backstage for 5 years, so we shifted from social media management to more strategic focus, and I started teaching how to. And so in 2014, 2015, we launched the first Rockstar Guide, which was training courses I sold. We rolled that into a membership site in 2015, 2016 that we eventually closed in late 2020. But we launched this agency, Uncommonly More, in late 2018, early 2019. January 1st, 2019 was our first official day as the agency. So there's been some changes, and oftentimes those changes did need to impact the show. This is where I'm going to point you back to that podcast rebrand episode we did in December, because the rebrands that had to happen and the conversations that I was having with myself, with my mentors, with my team at those stages, the why behind some of those decision changes are really important. So make sure you listen to that episode with this episode. Even if you've listened to it before, maybe tune in again, listen to it again. If this is something that's really I think I'm there, check in, because that was really external changes that happened mostly for me. The first one, shifting from Hit the Mic to Uncommonly More, was very much so we're talking to different people and we're doing different things, and we need to have a visible external marker of that. And so we rebranded the show to really step into our big kid agency pants, so to speak, right? Really let the audience know the next steps we've been talking about for X amount of years are shifting. Here's this new home we have. Here's this new environment. And I kept listeners. I lost listeners. I gained new listeners. All of that happened when I made that change. But that was an external change that had to happen because of shifts in the offer and the audience that we were talking to. And so some of our shifts are internal, some of them external. The signs vary depending on what's going on. If you have felt any of those things, internal, external, whatever, let's talk a little bit about how we start to make those changes. When we're making internal changes, I'm a big fan of one at a time. So these are the changes we're making where nobody is really going to notice. Nobody is really going to even see or be aware of what these changes are. So when we're talking about like some of this boredom stuff, some of this procrastination stuff, where we're changing our recording process, we're changing our production process, whatever the case may be. So some examples of this for me are when I'm batching, when I am prepping something, my planning. So am I going to shift to, there are times when I shift away from having super minimal like working title and 3 bullet points to something like I more have for this episode, where I've got sort of a semi fleshed out intro. I've got my 3 bullet points with some sub points under them. I've got my call to action kind of semi scripted. I needed to lean more because I was a little in my head. And that's been the case for honestly most of this year. I have had, for the most part, a little more flushed out notes when I sit down, because I have been talking about some things. And we've got some episodes like this that are coming up where I get a little soapboxy, where I get a little ranty. These are things that drive me crazy. So I am proactively making my lift a little easier and my focus a little clearer when I'm still in that planning session. But that's something you wouldn't know about if I didn't tell you. An example of this for you and for our clients is bringing in or changing your production support. So starting to work with us after you've been DIYing your show, that is a behind the scenes internal change that may or may not be noticed by the people who listen. There will be changes. There will be noticeable changes to your show, very likely. But they're probably not going to pay attention. The reason I like to make these one at a time is I want to see if the change actually makes a change. There's impact. I want to know that the juice is worth the squeeze, right? By the way, one of my favorite cliches right now. I want to make sure that we are actually scratching the itch, solving the problem, whatever it is that caused the procrastination, that caused the boredom. And so I'll start with doing something like changing how the show notes are formatted, changing the day I record, the time of day I record, whatever I need to feel like the process feels different. I like to do these things one at a time again to make sure it's working. This is exponentially more true when we talk about bringing in a production team, especially if you've been DIYing your show, because bringing in that production team is going to create changes. So I really recommend, if you know right now that you want to work with an agency like ours, or maybe me, maybe us and the Uncommonly More team, you know Stacy and her team are going to produce my show one day. Great. Start preparing your show for that. Start making the recording and process changes that you will need to work with us. And if you want to know what those are, if you want to know what those expectations are, check out the What Working with Uncommonly More episode looks like, where I go through what our process is and I go through what happens. That way you can start preparing your show now. I'm going to tell you right now, little crib sheet on this, you're going to need to be ahead on episodes, but you're not going to need 47 banked. If you've got, it's really nice if you've got like 4-ish episodes ready to go when we start working, because then we can jump right in and get rolling. But if you're somebody who right now records on Monday and releases on Tuesday, you're going to need to make some recording process shifts before it's going to be easy for you to step into getting production support from someone else, because those shifts that will happen sort of inherently because you have brought in support and you have someone besides you doing some of that like post-production work, the editing and the show notes, all of that stuff, that's going to change your process a little. So if you can start aligning yourself with what that change will be, it will feel drastically less overwhelming than it will if you are going from I record on Monday and release on Tuesday to I've got a 4-week lead time between recording and the episode seeing the world. And I've got to make some shifts on, like, that'll impact how you market your show. That'll impact how you go about recording your show. It will impact how you plan. It really will impact everything. So start making those one step at a time changes now so you can start moving in the direction of bringing in high level, high value support. On the flip side, it's really hard to make one change at a time when we're talking about external stuff, but in some cases still wildly advisable. So the things that I do when I'm talking about one change at a time externally is moving from 2 episodes a week to 1 episode a week. I didn't do that and adjust the length of the show and change the name and rebrand. I didn't do that all in one fell swoop because the show would have been unrecognizable. What I did is I just dropped one of the episodes a week. Initially, I even went to like every other week was guest solo. So I still had that cadence. I just spread it out. And so what we were talking about, who I was connecting with, who the listener was, the title, the graphics, the cadence of the show all stayed the same. I just stretched out the timeline. I just shifted the frequency. And then when we started reducing guests, I didn't change what my solo shows look like. I just did them more frequently. On the flip side of that, when we rebranded the show last year, it was a light switch, baby. The show name changed, the cover art changed, the description changed. But the show, once you got into it, was mostly the same. We talked about the same stuff. I introed it in a very similar way. We have a very similar cadence to what the show felt like, November of 2022, as we do now. Because that was the kind of thing that needed to be sort of all inclusive. Like it was a rebrand rollout versus these little shifts, these little pieces, that if done too many at once, it becomes hard to know who to credit with the result. That's the line for me. Is I know that my description and my cover art and my title, no one of those things is really going to just revolutionize the show, right? But the combination of all of them could. On the flip side, changing the format of the show, changing the day of the week that the show drops, could change my day one downloads, could change my how the show gets listened to over the course of the week, could change some things, certainly. And so I don't want to make that change amongst 16 other changes because I don't know where to point to if I'm getting the result I want or if I'm getting a result I definitely don't want. So as you're making these changes, remember, keep them, for the most part, pretty one at a time, internally, externally. And 2, be mindful of why you're making a change. So the first step, talking about how we make these changes, the first step for me when I'm going to make a change is a process I learned from Tara Newman of the Bold Money Revolution, who I adore and have worked with in one way or another and frequently in multiple ways since 2015. We identify the purpose, the process, and the payoff. And that's really helped me get an understanding of why I am making that change. The very first thing we look at is what is the purpose here? If you cannot identify a purpose for that change, now is not the right time to make that change. If you have a clear understanding of why there is a change, the expectation that you expect on the other side of that change, and the process you want to roll that change out with, which is in order of how I just said that, your purpose, your payoff, and your process. If you know that, great, make the change. But again, if you sit down and you look at specifically the purpose part of that question, and you're like, I don't know, because I'm bored. No, it's not the right time, and it's not the right change. You will have a clear understanding of your purpose, your process, and your payoff if you are making that change intentionally. Cool? Quick shout out though for Sherzies. Go listen to Tara Newman's podcast. It's fantastic. She's got some really cool stuff coming out right now. Anyways, I want to wrap us up because we are going long here. I want to wrap us up talking about when to announce changes and when not to. Internal changes, don't announce them. Honestly, ever. I probably share the absolute most I would recommend someone share about the behind the scenes process. And that's because the behind the scenes process of the show is what's relevant to you. If I were a web designer, if I were a SEO expert, if I were a interior designer, I would not be telling you the behind the scenes of my podcast. And this is, I'm going to just drop this in at 30-ish minutes and never speak about it again, probably. This is one of those things that drives me insane. Having a podcast does not mean your show needs to be about podcasting. So often I see people who have zero interest in supporting their clients with podcasting, doing episodes twice a year around some kind of landmark, usually talking about their podcasting. I saw a person, a podcaster, not too long ago, and they're in a B2C market. They are selling essentially life coaching. I'm going to use the most general term, but they're essentially life coaches. They are not selling to business owners. And in their first, I want to say 50, maybe it was 100 episodes, they have like 6 episodes about podcasting, which is not at all what they talk about. They're in the general sense of the term, they're life coaches. They are selling to a employed business market who does not have any interest in building a business out of a podcast. Like they don't care. They don't want to launch podcasts. We do not need your 25 lessons learned in your first 25 episodes. Now, if you are somebody who's like an OBM and you handle like back end support and organization, then yeah. But craft those, first of all, still don't make it 25 lessons. No one should do that. But if you want to share 3 organizational tips I learned or 3, business development wins that came from my first 25 episodes of podcasting, cool, because those are things that you potentially support clients with. That's you demonstrating your expertise in a new and creative way. But there does not need to be an announcement about every change and why you're having it like it is a lesson on podcasting. You need to keep in mind when you're thinking about, do I announce this or don't I announce this? Is knowing this of any value to the listener? Is sharing this in alignment with the promise I made for this podcast? For me, more often than not, yes. And honestly, I could probably tell you more frequently when I make changes behind the scenes. Maybe it would be helpful. I don't know. If it would be, tell me. But if you're not talking about podcasting, you don't need to give them a whole back end reason for why you're doing things. Most people don't care. Let's talk about when it is relevant to make changes, though. Let's say you are shifting up the hosts of the show. Maybe you're somebody who's going to bring in guest hosts. Maybe you're somebody who works with a business partner and both of you have been doing the show and now only one of you is going to do the show. Or maybe only one of you has been doing the show and now you're both going to come to do the show more frequently. That's announceable because you're changing the experience. You're shifting the known entity of what happens when I come here. And so that could impact the trust factor, right? So we just want to prime them. Hey, when you come in to the show, when you sit down, when you listen, when we go for our walk tomorrow, whatever, next time, this is what's going to be happening. You might hear a different voice here. You might hear less voices here, whatever that might be. Great example of this is the rebrand. Hey, we rebranded the show. There's new cover art. There's a new title. Here's why. Here's what's happening. Here's what we're excited about. This is a great way to introduce change in your brand, in your business. This is when it's absolutely valuable to tell your audience. But we're moving from dropping episodes on Tuesday to Wednesday because we need, these are the things we've learned and we want to be able. No, that doesn't need to be announced. First of all, if somebody emails you the first Tuesday you miss and it's like, where's the show? Be like, oh, we shifted the release date. You'll see it in your inbox tomorrow. Like, that's fine. That's sufficient. You do not need to give an announcement. Again, I want you to come back to that question of, does sharing this information fulfill my promise that I made on what I deliver in this podcast? And if it doesn't, keep it to yourself. It's not announceable. It's not something you need to be, building on a full-on press release around. Cool? This was a long one. I suspect there'll be follow-up questions. Drop me an email, DM me on Instagram, wherever feels good. Let me know what else you want to talk about, and we can around this. Make sure you come right back here next week for episode 600. I'm super excited to share it with you. If you're interested in joining us for the Podcasters Roundtable, make sure you head over to uncommonlymore.com/roundtable. And heads up, there are a couple of spots left for podcast strategy intensives in May. If you are interested, let me know. And more importantly, head over to uncommonlymore.com/intensive to book yours. I will see you right back here next week for episode 600. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.